Namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is English talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal, which features online and in-person interviews with guests from different backgrounds. We discuss issues impacting Indigenous peoples worldwide. We foster connections and share a kind of lesson learned between each other. So in this weekly talk show, I have a guest from San Francisco. Her name is Lisa Hoffman. She is co-director of one of the well-known organization known as East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, which works on the issues of refugees and immigrants, mostly focused with the Indigenous peoples. So she is with us in a studio. First of all, welcome to the show. Lisa.
Namaste. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for visiting to Indigenous Television studio. And to start with our conversations, could you, as I told you, background a little bit about you, but could you introduce yourself a bit about your organizations, about your own self, and your involvement with the Indigenous people's issues?
Thank you. Yes. So East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, or we sometimes call it EBSC, was founded in 1982 in response to horrific civil wars and genocide in Central America. And in particular, over 200,000 indigenous Guatemalans were displaced and killed as part of these wars that were funded by the U.S. government and supported by the U.S. government. And so they started to flee for their safety and came to the U.S., and there were ordinary citizens and churches that listened to their stories and opened up and decided to provide protection, advocacy, and support for these people who were fleeing this violence. So there were over 60,000 refugees at that time, and they risked a lot to share their stories with the American public and to speak truth to power, to tell the truth to the American public about what was really happening, because the government at the time was lying about what was really happening in the wars. And it was the beginning of the U.S. Sanctuary Movement, which is continuing to this day, and indigenous Guatemalans in particular, people from all over Central America and Latin America in particular, have been at the heart of all of this work. Many of the people who fled in the 1980s were indigenous people from Guatemala, and so East Bay Sanctuary Covenant offered legal support to these refugees. They weren't refugees, actually, according to international definitions, but they were applying for asylum. And so we connected them with lawyers who could help them to attain legal status. After focusing on legal status, our programs grew to also provide other types of support to access social services and do community organizing and provide education for immigrants and asylum seekers, both indigenous and non-indigenous, who were coming to the San Francisco Bay Area for safety.
So you talked the background about your organization, how it was founded. And then the critical issue about the refugees and immigrant, what you talked, that actually touched to us as well. And when we talk about indigenous people's issues, that many indigenous people's land have been taken away, their territories, there are mining in their areas, and because of this border shift, many indigenous peoples actually have become refugees as well.
That's right.
And could you tell us your own experiences that some of the reason how indigenous peoples actually become a refugee, and what are some of the reason that?
Well, that's absolutely right. All of those reasons, some of the reasons really are rooted in colonization and in situations where their land was stolen, where they were no longer able to farm the land. Many are agricultural workers growing their own food, and if their land is stolen and they're no longer able to feed their families, they may be forced to work on plantations or for multinational corporations. But they become often internal migrants or displaced within a country. But in many places, there's systemic discrimination against Indigenous people, where they may not be able to freely speak or learn their own language, or express their cultural traditions, and then are deprived of the capacity to own their land or feed their families. All of this is being exacerbated by mining and other extractive industries that are taking over the lands of Indigenous people, often killing Indigenous people in the process and forcing people to flee for their own safety. And a lot of this was happening in the civil wars in the 1980s, where waves of Indigenous peoples were seeking safety in what they call El Norte, in the north. And many Indigenous Mayamam who are from Guatemala ended up settling in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. And now estimates are anywhere from 20 to 40,000 Mayamam speakers in the Bay Area. And, I talked about the founding of East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, but one of the initiatives that we're most excited and proud to partner on is an Indigenous-led radio station called Radio Balam and Voces Maya. And Radio Balam refers to an important figure in Indigenous Guatemalan history, a warrior who fought for his people, and Voces Maya means Mayan voices. So it was founded in 2020 by a young Indigenous activist named Crescencio Ramirez, who recognized in the pandemic that the people who speak Mam, we did not have any access to information about the COVID-19 pandemic. And so he started transmitting via Facebook Live and just started trying to offer information to the Mayamam speaking population in the area. So that was in 2020. 4 years later, the program has 73,000 followers and offers weekly talk show radio programs via Facebook Live on a variety of issues that the local Indigenous community, immigrant community, are interested in, helping them to navigate legal systems and questions, to learn about different social services, support for families and parents, health issues, access to mental health, and just really whatever issues the community is caring about. That's what's talked about in the radio programs. Also uplifting community festivals and funerals or weddings or gatherings where people can connect even transnationally, because they're able to show ceremonies and festivals from Guatemala. There are followers in Guatemala as well as across the United States. And so it's a way of strengthening cultural pride and connection for Mam speakers.
All right, so that's really great news that at least some, Indigenous youth have started their own radio and giving voices to the community in the language that they speak and understand. As your earlier, I'll come back a little later about the Radio Balam, But earlier in your descriptions, what you said about the refugees, earlier that refugees is linked with the colonizations, but there is no more colonizing from outside recently and lately. There are other reasons that why indigenous peoples become refugees, as you said. Is this because now lately there has been only a few world war or war between the countries too, and there are also instances within the country there is also war because of which caused the refugees, as you said.
Yes. And, I mentioned the colonization because that's at the root of the discrimination and lack of access to resources even within their countries that indigenous people face. They're, typically more discriminated against than people who are not indigenous. But it also is at the root of subsequent problems, including, as we talked about, the extractive industries that, it's being exacerbated now by climate change and the climate crisis where, lands have been taken over and, there's more hurricanes and mudslides and flooding, and I know you've experienced that here in Nepal as well. And it has a disproportionate impact on indigenous peoples who are living in some of these areas, are some of the reasons. The other thing that was happening, over the last decades is that because of the destabilization in those areas, gangs were able to take root and further make situations very dangerous for, especially for vulnerable indigenous people in those places.
So even within the refugees, let's say, is there any issue-wise differences, or are indigenous peoples more vulnerable comparatively with non-indigenous refugees?
Absolutely, they're more vulnerable. And, they're, again, it's based in discrimination in their home country as well as discrimination along the way. Sometimes people in the U.S., for example, may see indigenous Mayamam immigrants as Latino because they come from a Central American country, for example. But they're not Latino. They're indigenous, and they have their own language and their own culture and their own practices. And they've experienced even discrimination from other Latinos, from the Latino population. So one of the things, for example, one of our recent initiatives is that indigenous immigrants, indigenous mom immigrants, are stopped by the police, and the police may speak to them in English or Spanish, but if they don't understand that, then they're being arrested at higher rates than if they had interpretation available, or if they were understood to be indigenous versus Latino. And so we're working with the local public defender's office to raise awareness about this systemic bias against indigenous immigrants and help indigenous immigrants to understand that they have the right to interpretation if they're stopped by the police. And so there's a lot of layers of discrimination that indigenous immigrants experience beyond the discrimination that a Latino immigrant might experience, for example.
That means that even though they are refugees, indigenous people should be given more care, more support, right, from your experiences?
In my experience, we need to have a deeper understanding of the unique circumstances of indigenous refugees and asylum seekers. Many of the indigenous people that we work with do not have formal refugee status, which would allow them to access many more resources and support. So as asylum seekers, they don't have access to all of those programs. Once they receive asylum, they can have access to more support. But there's just all of these layers of discrimination that are not well understood by the broader public.
So thank you for giving this all background and also earlier sharing about the Radio Balam, which was founded in 2020 to give a voice for this immigrant, refugee, Maya Mom speaking communities.
Yes.
Could you just tell us a little, you already told us about the background, how this Radio Balam was actually founded for giving voices for indigenous peoples.
That's right.
So could you just tell us how indigenous-led media, just like Radio Balam, is more trustworthy or giving informations to the indigenous peoples? What sort of role can they play to the communities if that media is led by the indigenous peoples themselves or in the language that they speak and understand?
Oh, it's just huge. So, many indigenous immigrants in our area don't speak, as I said, don't speak English or Spanish. Also, they might not have any trust of U.S. media or even Spanish language media because those media don't understand who they are and what their language is and what their culture is. And so having a media institution and a program that is led by indigenous Maya Mom people in their own language has been transformative, as evidenced by growing followers every year, adding thousands more followers. Now every program has 6,000 or 7,000 average views. Some of them have 10,000 live views, and then more in repeated viewings. And it's a very important medium for the Maya Mom community. The Maya Mom language is not a written language, and so radio and video are much more effective means of communication. Also, Facebook is a very common social media platform for the Mom community, so having Facebook Live programs that people can listen to on their way to work or on the way home from work has been a really good mechanism. The team, Radio Balam and Voces Maya, pairs that with connection to a hotline where people can call and speak to somebody in Maya Mom, or somebody will call them back if they have more questions about any of the themes that come up on the radio program. And then our Voces Maya team also is out in the community in person talking to people about their issues and figuring out what themes are going to be covered on the show, but also helping people directly with their needs of how to navigate these U.S. systems that are otherwise not accessible to indigenous immigrants.
Good. So you told me in background that you have traveled many countries working for the refugees. Also, you have observed some of the medias led by indigenous peoples. You were just telling me that you traveled to the Guatemala. There is also some medias led by indigenous peoples in Thailand and other countries. Could you share some of the example how the indigenous-led medias are giving voices to the indigenous peoples who are the voiceless around the world? Could you just tell us, share your experiences?
Well, I can share about a program that I worked with for a while in the Peruvian Amazon. So this is indigenous-led radio station in a part of Peru where there are no roads and the villages are along the river. And the founders of this program, which is called Minga Peru, realized that, a few different things. One way to reach the far villages, that radio would be a good way to reach them, and that they wanted to be listener-led. So they wanted every program to be based on what the listeners were interested in. And so what happens is that people in the villages will write letters, sometimes on bark or on whatever they can find, and they give it to the drivers of the boats, who then take it to the main city where the radio station is, and they construct a radio program based on those letters. They also simultaneously have training programs for women. It's a women-led program focused on women's leadership and gender issues, and those promotoras, or promoters, representatives, then go back to their villages and share the information with other people in their communities. Also very youth focused, where the radio programs sometimes can cover themes, collaborate with teachers and educators to talk about themes like global warming and reforestation and horticulture and planting trees and local plant medicine and all sorts of things that are relevant to the Indigenous communities. And, they're doing it also in a number of different Indigenous languages, and reaching people who otherwise would not have access to information. Also focusing on reproductive health and ending violence against women and other ways of supporting families. When there's no radio, you were talking earlier about how in Nepal sometimes, there may not be radio towers or satellites, and similarly in these areas, what they do is they make recordings and then they get them to the local schools who have loudspeakers set up, and so the whole village can listen to the program on the loudspeaker, and it's become an integral part of the community.
It shows that it's not easy to start Indigenous-led media.
No, it's not. It's not easy at all.
And there is also constant challenges that, even we have similar experiences. We founded Indigenous television in Nepal. This is one of the first multilingual television, but it's really hard to get the funding, the financial resources, even from the outsider, because they directly don't give the funding for the media as such. But could you just tell your experiences that how the Radio Balam has been able to sustain itself, and how do you see the future in terms of financial and building a capacity to build the capacity and attract more and more Indigenous youth journalists in this area?
Well, I can share a little bit of our experience, but that's why I was asking you all those questions earlier. It's like, how do we get more resources to support this really important way of connecting with communities and helping them to get their needs met and navigate these systems that are around them. So Radio Balam is funded by grants from foundations, some contracts from state government. We're very fortunate in California to have support from the state government for programs like East Bay Sanctuary Covenant and some of the outreach work that we're doing in the Hmong community, and then individual donations. But it's really difficult, and the resources are scarce, and there's a need. You were talking earlier about how many young Indigenous people in Nepal need to earn more money than they can earn in Indigenous media, and it's the same for us. So, many of our community-based journalists have other jobs, and then they do this part-time, and, but we've been slowly building the capacity of the team, both financially and then also in terms of skills, and they've gained a very strong reputation in the community. Last year they won a statewide ethnic media award in California, which was a great honor and a wonderful recognition of their groundbreaking work to provide Indigenous-led media in the Mam language. So there's been a lot of successes, and the founders and the members of the team, Crescencio and Esmeralda and Katy and Leticia and Marta Rosalba, they are continuing to grow in their commitment. They're also gaining trust in the Mam community, as well as with partner organizations who want to understand how to reach Indigenous immigrant communities in our area. And so it's exciting. There's in terms of the future, you know, I think the dream is to continue to build the capacity of the organization to be able to continue to provide this this really needed service for these communities who otherwise, again, do not have access. There's no way they can access that information and support in any other way because there's so many barriers.
True. So we have come almost at the end of the show, but we have talked a lot about the Radio Balam, Indigenous-led radio, its role, and also your work under the East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, that organization you are serving with Indigenous refugees and also immigrants. At last, I would like to give you maybe a minute to give a message to the Indigenous communities, our brothers and sisters who are working in the same area, if you have something to share.
Well, I guess I would say, as we had spoken about earlier, this work is important. Your language and your culture matters, and there's a global movement of Indigenous-led media activists who are supporting Indigenous communities in their own language. And I am myself very honored to partner with my Indigenous colleagues to transform these systems and truly support Indigenous communities to be able to live in the ways that they want to live and practice their own language and cultural traditions in their communities. So I guess the message is to keep going and find strength in connecting with others who are also working on these issues, and together we can do it.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your time to visit Indigenous television and joining on the Dave's Hammer Show, and also for your insights.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be here with you.
With this, we have reached at the end of the show, but the conversation continues. If you have any queries or feedbacks in regards to the program, you can reach us at indigenous-television@gmail.com. Please join us next week. Next week we will invite new guests and we'll be discussing on new issues. By then, have a nice weekend. Namaste.